With the help of Hashem, we are learning Chagiga Daf Zayin. We left off on Daf Vav Amid Beis, the last line in the bottom of the Amid. We're going to begin today by quoting a Mishnah that all of us say every morning after Birchas HaShachar, Ki Yadua, that we say both a pasuk in Chumash after we make the blessings, and that's Birchas Kohanim, as well as we quote a part of Torah Shebal Peh, which is the first Mishnah, the first Perek of Masechtas Peah, Elu Devarim She'ein Lohem Shiur. The following mitzvahs don't have a lower limit, they don't have an upper limit, as we'll explain, even though the more you do, the greater the mitzvah, the more the mitzvah. One of the mitzvahs that are mentioned in the Mishnah is Hara Oyoin, which means the mitzvah either of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash or coming with a carbon oila, or both. And as we will see, there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish how to understand this line in the Mishnah, this mitzvah of Ra'ayin. Really, the question is, for sure, showing up many times throughout Yom Tiv. Every time you come, you fulfill again the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash. The question is one obligated, that's the initial understanding, to bring with him, every time they show up over Yom Tov, another carbon oila? That Rabbi Yechanan holds that mitzvah to show up, but you're not obligated to bring a carbon oila. Reish Lakish, the initial understanding, holds that every time you appear throughout Yom Tov, imagine you have to bring another carbon oila. And then the Gemara is going to clarify that that cannot be their argument. Everyone will hold that when you show up on the first time, you have to bring a carbon oila. But once you bring one time that sacrifice, you're not obligated to bring it every time you come back to the Azara throughout the Yom Tiv. The question is whether you are allowed to bring another carbon oila. And as the Gemara will explain, that Rabbi Yechanan subscribes to the concept of Bal Toisif. Interestingly, since I already brought once, the first day that I appeared in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Tov, I brought my carbon oilas re'iyah. If I were to bring another carbon oilas re'iyah, I'm violating thou shall not add to the mitzvahs. Now, chevra, a carbon oila can be brought as a donation carbon as many times as you want. We're not speaking about that. We're speaking about someone who's bringing a carbon for the purpose of fulfilling the obligation of bringing a carbon oila when you appear in the Beis HaMikdash over Yom Tiv. That will be the final understanding. Rabbi Yechanan holds that there is a Bal Toisev aspect, you may not, and Reish Lakish holds that you are allowed to. No one holds that you have to. On Daf Zayin Amud Beis, we're going to start the second Mishnah of the Masechta. And really, three dafim, beginning with Zayin, Ches, and Tes, are dafim straight out of Kachim, which is really the topic of the first half of the Masechta. So as we have been learning that there is an obligation to bring a carbon oilas re'iyah, there is another carbon called Shalmei Chagiga. Whenever we run out of the meat of Shalmei Chagiga, there is an obligation connected to V'samachta Bechagecha to bring throughout Yom Tiv another carbon that we will call Shalmei Simcha. Question is as follows: for all of us that live in the Holy Land, and we separate the proper Trumas u'Maisres, and we accumulate over the time a lot of money that is Maiser Sheni money, meaning that the produce that's separated for Maiser Sheni is allowed to be exchanged and redeemed over money, freeing up the produce, but then imbuing that money with the Kedusha of Maiser Sheni. Now that money belongs to the owner, but that money must be taken to Yerushalayim, and you can only use this money to buy food items which you will buy and consume in Yerushalayim. Question is, we have so many obligations as far as bringing sacrifices over Yom Tov is concerned. We also, most of us, when we come to Yerushalayim, we will have a lot of Maiser Sheni money. Am I allowed to use the Maiser Sheni money to buy these Carbonaries? That's the topic. Now I want you to know that Bichlal, people would use the Maiser Sheni money to buy carbon shlamims, but these are donation shlamims. These are not obligatory shlamims. And there is a rule called Kol Davar Shebachayva Eino Ba'a Ela Min Achulin, that whenever I have an obligation that costs money, a mitzvah like here to buy Carbonaries, I can only buy it from unconsecrated funds. And therefore, we'll begin with the rule that you may not fulfill your obligations by using Meiser Sheni money, but then we'll see in the Mishnah there are many exceptions. Firstly, like we said, and we keep on saying that Chagigas, that Shalmei Chagiga is taken obligation. Shalmei Simcha means that since I have to have joy over Yom Tif, and joy is also had by having meat, and it includes, and actually it's ideal to have sacrificial meat. But if a person were to bring any other obligatory carbon, like the Shalmei Chagiga, you already fulfilled the Simcha by eating the Shalmei Chagiga. So as far as buying additional Shalmei Simcha is concerned, you are allowed to use Meiser Sheni money. As far as buying Oilas Re'iyah, we will see you may not use Meiser Sheni money. However, when it comes to buying the Shalmei Chagiga, there's going to be a phenomenal machlokes that will have to be explained, and that's already going to lead us into the final daf, the next daf Ches. We're going to also learn, if we'll have time in this daf, some rules regarding Pesach, how on the 14th day of Pesach, Erev Pesach, there was another Chagiga that was brought that's called Chagigas Yud Daled, and God willing, if we'll get there, we'll explain all of these details as we unpackage today's daf. So we are up to Daf Vav Amid Beis, again the last line in the Amid. We are familiar with the Mishnah, and let's learn it inside. Tanan Hasam, we learned over there in Peah. Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Elu Devarim, the following things, referring to mitzvahs, she'ein lohem shiur, they have no measure. What do we mean by a measure? Certain mitzvahs have a minimum measure. They have what we call a under limit, that if it's done less than, like for example, we have to eat matzah on Pesach. Well, you have to eat a kazayis. If you ate less than a kazayis, you did not fulfill the obligation. That's called a measure. It's called an under measure. A max measure means there are certain mitzvahs that once you did it to a certain point, adding doesn't add to the mitzvah, doesn't do anything. Ein lehem shir means that there is no minimum amount, but there's no maximum amount. No matter how much you add, you continuously get a greater mitzvah. And let's go through the various mitzvahs. So Daf Zayin. Number one, Peah. Peah is a mitzvah that when we own land in the Holy Land and we harvest whatever we are growing there, every field needs to leave, the owner when he harvests, needs to leave an edge. Peah means a corner, but it doesn't mean a corner. It means an edge, a little end of the field at any point that they want for the poor. Now, biblically, I can harvest the entire field and leave one stalk, and I fulfill the mitzvah of Peah. That's the meaning. There is no minimum measure. On the other hand, if I were to harvest only one stalk and leave everything else for the poor, I fulfill the mitzvah of Peah. In other words, it's not that I have to take for myself a certain amount. I can leave the minimum and I can leave the maximum, and in both cases I fulfill the mitzvah. Happens to be clearly that our Mishnah is only speaking about the biblical, the mitzvah on a biblical level, because on a rabbinic level, a person has to leave at least a 60th for the poor. So there is a minimum shir. Midrabanan, our Mishnah again is speaking midoraisa. The next is Bikurim. Bikurim is that again, this is connected to the Holy Land, that if a person is growing any one of the 7 items that we praise Eretz Yisrael with, which is wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. So you have to separate the first budding, the first of the fruits, and when you will finally harvest it, you're going to bring it to Yerushalayim with the whole ceremony as it's written out in Parshas Kisavei. So how much do you have to bring to Yerushalayim from each one of these 7 species? There is no minimum amount, and there's no maximum amount. The more the better. The more the better, meaning the more you bring, the greater the mitzvah you have. I want to say there are many mitzvahs that they don't have an upper limit, but there comes a point where you're not adding to the mitzvah. I'll just give you an example. The size of an esrog. So we learned, if you remember, Masechta Sukkah, there is minimum shiurim. Like the lulav has to have at least a tefach and a little bit protruding. The lulav has to have, it's escaping my mind, the minimum shir. I think it is 3 tvachim or 4 tvachim, enough kedei linanua. Now, what's the up shir? There's no limit. But we don't say by the lulav that if you have a foot tall lulav or 5 feet, the 5 feet lulav is even a greater mitzvah. There is no upper limit, but it doesn't mean anything. In our Mishnah, what's unique is that the more, the greater the mitzvah. That's the beautiful thing. So Bikurim, the more you bring to Yerushalayim, the greater the mitzvah. But you can fulfill your obligation by bringing just the first of the 7. I want you to know that the Rambam holds that also midrabanan Bikurim has to be at least a 60th of that product. So again, there is a minimum share, but only midrabanan, and the Mishnah is speaking about midoraisa. Now, this is going to be our topic. The third item mentioned in the Mishnah is hara'ayin, which is the mitzvah of appearing. So when we go to Yerushalayim over the 3 Yomim Tovim, and we come into the Beis HaMikdash, ideally on the first day, did I fulfill my obligation? Yes, I did. But if I'm going to appear again, on the same day again, tomorrow again, I'm getting more mitzvah. And I can appear as many times as I want. And every time I appear, I'm getting an additional mitzvah for appearing in the Beis HaMikdash over Yom Tov. Now, what will become clear in our sugya is that the word hara'ayin doesn't only mean appearing. It also means to bring a carbon oilas re'iyah. If that would be the meaning, then the Mishnah would be saying that every time you come, either you have to bring another carbon, or if you bring every time another carbon oilas re'iyah, you're getting another mitzvah. That will be the topic of our sugya. But let's finish the Mishnah. Gemilas chasadim. Gemilas chasadim doesn't have a minimum amount. Any act of kindness is a mitzvah, and the more you do, the greater the mitzvah. And as we know, that midrabanan, when it comes to gemilus chasadim with one's finances, there is midrabanan an upper limit. As Chazal tell us that al yevazveis yoiser mechaimish, a person should not give more than 20% of what they own to tzedakah, and then ki yodua, that the Alter Rebbe paskins, not only al pi pnimius, but al pi nigla, al pi halacha, that this is only true for people that only give tzedakah for the mitzvah of tzedakah. But since tzedakah also has an aspect of kapara involved, when a person does tshuva, adding to the tshuva tzedakah is like bringing a carbon, and we all need to do tshuva. And when it comes to the healing of the soul, like when it comes to the healing of the body, Chazal never put a limit, or you can't spend more than that amount of money by a doctor. A person would sell all their belongings to get healing if they have to. And if that's true for the body, that's certainly true for the soul. So the Alter Rebbe holds that nowadays, that we all need tshuva and we all need kapara, there isn't even an upper limit midrabanan. But again, our Mishnah is speaking about midorais. And the final one is Talmud Torah. Now, Talmud Torah, I want you to know that there is a concept of v'higisa b'yoymam v'layla, which means that when a person has free time, they should spend it by learning Torah. So there is, you can't say there's no minimum. No, you have to learn in all your free time. But if you have no free time, then you can fulfill the mitzvah of learning by day and by night, by learning just a little bit in the day and a little bit by night, having 2 shiurim. And on the other hand, the more you learn, the greater the mitzvah. Again, that's unique about these mitzvahs. All the other mitzvahs, even if they don't have a limit the way you think they have a limit, but when you add, like we gave an example, you add to the height of the lulav, you're not adding to the mitzvah. These that are mentioned, even though they don't have an under limit, but the more you do, the greater the mitzvah. And now, let's begin with the machlokes, how to interpret hara'ayin, which generally refers to the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash over Yom Tov. So Amar Rabbi Yechanan, the second line from the top, that kisfurim anu loymar, that we initially understood that when the Mishnah speaks about hara'ayin, there it only means hara'ayin ein lo shir l'maylam, that there is no upper limit. In other words, you can bring as many carbonaries oilas re'iyah as you want. And the chiddush will be that we don't say once you brought one oilas re'iyah, bringing another oilas re'iyah is bal toisif. No, there is not. There's no upper limit. Avol yesh lo shir lamata, but there is a minimum limit. What's the minimum limit? First Mishnah, if you remember, we learned the machlekes beishamai and beisilul. What's the minimum value of the carbon? And the initial understanding of Rabbi Yechanan that this minimum value is a biblical concept. If midoiraisa, whether beishamai, whether beisilul, whether 1 ma'ah, whether 2 ma'ah would be a din doiraisa, then there is an under limit, because it can be an animal that has less than that value. And the limaid, and he told us that that on a biblical level, there isn't a minimum amount. If you find an animal that's worth less than the shiurim given either by beishamai or than beisilul, you'll fulfill their obligation. The minimum amount of money is midarabanan. Abul chachamim oimrim horeiyah ma'a kesef. This is quoting the sheet of Beis Hillel, and the Chagiga has to have shtei kesef. So now it's very consistent that since the Mishnah is speaking about midoiraisa, all of the cases enumerated in the Mishnah, Peya, Bikurim, Haro'oyin, Gemilas Chasadim, and Talmud Torah, have no under limit and they have no max limit. Now the question is,
can you speak out the difference in taich between Hara'iyah and Hara'ayom?
So the word Re'iyah, as we'll see right now, at least according to Rashi, refers to the carbon. Ra'oyin implies appearing, and it actually has almost like a double connotation. That's the next line in the Gemara, Yaakov. My hara'oyin. Why didn't the Mishnah say hara'iyah? Then it would be clear we're speaking about the sacrifice. The fact that the Mishnah uses the words hara'oyin means that we are also speaking about the mitzvah of appearing on Yom Tov. So Rabbi Yechanan Amar, it means re'iyas panim ba'azaram. In other words, the initial understanding, what it is that we are dafken not speaking about a carbon. We are dafka not speaking about we are speaking about appearing. In other words, that the point of the Mishnah is that you appeared once, you fulfilled your obligation. And you can appear as many times as you want, and every time you show up again, you get another mitzvah. And listen to the in between the line, and you don't need to appear with a carbon. No, it's the first time I come to the Beis HaMikdash. The Torah says, "V'lo yeira'u panai reikam." I cannot come empty-handed. If I'm going to show up without a carbon oilas re'iyah, you can argue it's not only that I kept the mitzvah, I did the mitzvah of showing up, I just missed the mitzvah of not coming empty-handed. Part of appearing the first time means to appear with a sacrifice. If a person didn't come with a sacrifice, they are lacking the mitzvah of appearing. But that's only the first time. Once you came the first time with a carbon, now you can come, and every time you come, you get a mitzvah of appearing, and you don't need to bring a sacrifice. That's the initial Rabbi Yechanan. Reish Lakish disagrees, and he says, the Mishnah is speaking about both. Yeah, there is no upper limit. You can come as many times as you want. But every time you come over Yom Tov, you have to come with another carbon. Oilas re'iyam. Reish Lakish Amar re'iyas panim bikarbon. And just like the first time, if you appeared without a carbon, it's not that you kept one mitzvah, but you violated the negative mitzvah. No, you are lacking in the mitzvah of showing up. Showing up means to show up with a sacrifice. That's what showing up means. Amazing concepts. Reish Lakish says that's true not only the first time. Even though once you brought a carbon the first time, you fulfilled your obligation. And on a biblical level, the carbon can have even less value than the ma'ah. But if you're going to come again, you have to come with a carbon. Says the Gemara like this. Be'ikar haregel, the word ikar means the first day, or the first time you're showing up. Be'ikar haregel kol alma lo pligi, the iyas panim be'karbon, that you have to show up with a carbon. And guys, many people can argue, is there a concept of esadoy chaloisasa, as we will learn in Yavamis in the beginning? Because there is a mitzvah to show up. There is a negative mitzvah, v'lo yero panai reikam. What happens if a person cannot even afford the carbon? Should they show up, at least they're doing the positive? No, we don't say that here. Again, the meaning of showing up the first time means with a carbon. And there's no debate about that. Ki pligi, again, this is the initial understanding of their machlokes. B'sha'ar yemay saregel, during the other days of the Yom Tov. And by the way, according to many Rishonim, not only during the other days of Yom Tov. If a person showed up the first day in the morning, at night there's no Carbonaries. And then they went home, and then they want to come back for mincha in the Azara, in the temple compound. This also is part of the question. Do we say that every time, the fact that you left, now you are re-entering, you are reappearing, you got to come with a carbon? So again, the Gemara says like this. Again, the initial understanding, if you are opting to bring every time you come back a carbon, the initial understanding is that no one is suggesting that there is a violation of adding to the mitzvahs, Bal Toisef. You can bring it. Ki pligi, what's the initial understanding of the argument? If you came again and you didn't bring a carbon, the asav aloy yaisi, Rabbi Yechanan holds, the iyas panim ba'azara, the chol emas, the asi loy tzarech la'asuyeh. The Mishnah, Yaakov, used the words ra'oyoin. The Mishnah did not use the words re'iyah. To emphasize re'iyah has a limit. Once you brought it once, you don't have to bring it again. You could, but you don't have to. Showing up, every time you show up, you're doing the mitzvah of showing up. Reish Lakish says, no, ra'oyin means both. There's no upper limit. If you came once with a carbon, you're good to go. But if you want to come again, you get a mitzvah, but you only get a mitzvah if you come with a carbon. Re'iyas panim be'carbon, meaning the whole lemas dasi. Throughout the Yontiv, every time you appear, you have to tzarech la'asuya, you have to bring a carbon. Well, now these questions.
They don't have money for a carbon? Do they not come at all? If they don't have enough money.
They would. The according to Beis Hillel, David, if the person had money to travel, if a person has money to buy a piece of bread, you have money to buy a carbon. People say they don't have money, you have to know what that means. Okay, you're asking, what about a real destitute person that doesn't have food on Yom Tov? What does that person do if they don't have food on Yom Tov? God forbid. They would borrow money, right? No one is going to starve to death. So part of the living for a Yid is that you have this Yiddishkeit. Like, what do I can't... You can't borrow. In other words, you can't borrow someone else's tefillin, meaning you can't borrow someone else's carbon. You got to have your own. Okay. It says in the pasuk, "V'lo yero panay rekom." Don't show up empty-handed. How can you allow the person to come on Yom Tov again without a carbon? So Amar Lei, the verse in Mishpatim is only speaking about the ikar hanegel, which means the first time. Another question. Eisvei says in a Braisa on this pasuk, "V'lo yero panei rekom," says the Braisa that means dafke bizvachim, animal sacrifices. Says the Braisa, do you say that it only means animal sacrifices? Maybe it also allows for you to bring bird sacrifices. Maybe it should allow for you to bring flower sacrifices. Says the Braisa, no, vidinhu. Logically, it has to be animal sacrifices. Why? Because Nemra Chagiga Lehedyet, the mitzvah of Chagiga is clearly an animal, because in the mitzvah of bringing a Chagiga, Shalmei Chagiga, the Torah says, V'lo yolin chelev chagi ad boichen. The Torah is speaking about a certain specific detail of an animal sacrifice, which is that the fats have to be burnt either on the day that the blood was sprinkled, or night after, but you can't allow it to go into the next day. In other words, the fact that the Torah links the fats to Chagiga clearly indicates that the carbon Chagiga has to be an animal. Birds don't have these fats. Flowers don't have these fats. And the Torah also speaks about the mitzvah of Re'iyah, which is the oil, which is to God. So it doesn't make sense. So ma Chagiga, ha'amura lehedyet, just like the Chagiga, which is also eaten by the person, is only zevachim. So afreiyah makes sense, should only be as it is. Hamura legavaya can only be an animal sacrifice. The Braisa continues. Umahein zevachim, what zevachim are we talking about? Oilois, animals that are completely burnt up. Furthermore, asks the Braisa, ato oimer oilois, maybe the re'iyah is also a shlamim. So the Braisa answers, no, it's not. Again, logically, I will tell you that the zevach has to be an oil, because nemra chagiga lehedyet. So ma, in other words, it says Re'iyah legvoya. Rashi says, it says lo yerou panai. Don't see my face empty-handed, which implies that what I'm asking you right now is for me. Don't see my face empty-handed, because what you will bring will be for me, meaning for God. Ma chagiga, that is lehedyet, is beroloi. It's a carbon that is fit to be eaten by the owner, because that's the nature of a shlamim. Some of it is eaten by the owner. Afreiyah ha'amura legavaya. Again, from the words, don't see my face, what you're bringing is for me. It means something that's exclusively for God, which means a carbon oil. And then the Braisa says, the final line, v'chein b'din, and it makes sense. Shelo yehei shulchan chamale. It doesn't make sense that your table is going to be full of food, and the shulchan rabcha, the table of your master, referring to God, is going to be empty. That can be. So 1 second. Now we know that our table is full with carbonaries, not only on the first day, not only on the second day, like we keep on mentioning. The moment I run out of the meat from the Shalmei Chagiga, because of the other mitzvah of simcha v'samachta b'chagecha, I have to bring throughout the Yom Tiv. If I don't have other sacrificial meat, I have to constantly bring shlomims. In other words, my table is going to be filled with meat because of the samachta b'chagecha throughout the Yom Tiv. So the Gemara is asking logically, since we are saying we don't want for your table to be full and God's table to be empty, if that's the case, then a korban oilas re'iyah should be brought throughout Yom Tiv. Should be brought throughout Yom Tiv. Because if not, there's going to be days in the Yom Tiv that I'm going to have sacrificial meat on my table, but nothing is going to be brought for God. Again, this l'chu'ura is a question on Rabbi Yechanan. So again, Rabbi Yechanan will say, no, be'ikar regel. This logic, we will only say on the first day. We don't have to say it throughout. Okay. Eisvei, nachakashem. It says in Abraisa, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sholish Regalim Bashana. Throughout 3 times in the year. Nitztava Yisrael Alis Beregel, the Jewish people were commanded to go up to walk up to the Azara. What are the 3 dates? Chag HaMatzois, and in the Chag HaShavuos, and in the Chag HaSukkos. Says the Braisa, says Rabbi Yossi, statement number 1 that is enigmatic, that will have to be explained. Ve'ein nidin chatzoyin. Don't come in halves, or don't come in groups. The Gemara will explain soon what that means. Why? Because it says, Kol zechurcha, all of your menfold. Let's shelve that. We're going to come back to this. Another rule, the ein nidin reikanim. Don't come empty-handed, because it says v'lo yiro panay reikam. So again, it's mashma. Don't come empty-handed would mean that every time you re-enter the temple complex throughout these holidays, you should have to bring another carbon. And lo yiro panay reikam is specific to oilas re'iyah, as we just quoted. So again, Rabbi Yechanan will farenfer amaleino beikar haregel. Okay. Eisvei, now finally, the opposite direction. Rabbi Yechanan is now going to challenge Reish Lakish. Now, I think all of these challenges were not done in between them. I think this is the Gemara bringing up challenges as if Rabbi Yechanan asked Reish Lakish, as if Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yechanan, because we'll see in a few lines that we completely misunderstood their opinions. So, let's based on this understanding, this would be the question that Rabbi Yechanan would ask of Reish Lakish. And we had this chazal already a few times in the Masechta. And even though we have the mikra, we have the way we know the Torah has to be read in public. And that is, we read the words yei ra'eh, but since the Torah has no vowels, there is a possibility of reading the correct letters, Yud, Resh, Aleph, Hey, Yireh, and we learn one from the other. Yireh, yei ra'eh. God seeing us and us seeing God have to be similar. Now, we learned that above regarding the blind person in one eye. But now we're going to learn another chazal. And what is that? That ma ani bechinam. God sees us without bringing a carbon. God doesn't bring a carbon when he comes to the temple to see us. Af atam bechinam. When we go, we can see God also. Now, you don't have to pay every time you enter the temple with a carbon. Now this is mamish akasha against Reish Lakish. If the understanding of Reish Lakish, it would have been the way we had until now. Reish Lakish holds that during Yom Tov, every time you show up, you got to bring a carbon. Every time you walk into the shul, you got to make a donation. Then that's not what it says in this Braisa. This Braisa clearly says that, the first time you have to bring a carbon. Not every time. You can show up bechinam. You can show up for free. You don't have to pay a ticket every time. Ella, therefore, the Gemara revises its understanding of their argument, the first wide line. This is very important. And it's not that they changed their minds. We now get to the right understanding. Every time a Jew comes into the temple throughout Yom Tov, as long as I brought the carbon the first time I came on Yom Tov, ideally it should be the first day. Once I fulfilled that mitzvah, I am allowed to come back as many times as I want, and I don't have to bring a carbon. Ma'ani bechinam, afatem bechinam. The question is, if I am opting in to bring another oilas re'iyah. Ki pligi da osava aisi. I brought the first time. I fulfilled my obligation. Now I'm coming back, and I want to bring not a donation, which I can bring donation Carbonaries, not on Yom Tov or during Chol HaMoed. I want to bring an oilas re'iyah. Rabbi Yechanan holds re'iyas panim ba'azara, that when the Braisa says, when the Mishnah says, hara oyoin, has no upper limit, the Braisa only means appearing. Re'iyas panim hu de'ein lo shir. Which means that Re'iyah itself, the Karban Re'iyah, has an upper limit. You know what the upper limit is? You can only bring one. And if you're going to want to bring more than one, you are not allowed to. This is called a violation of Baal Toisef. Which is fascinating. Because normally Baal Toisef would mean, let's say when I put on tefillin, tefillin has 4 portions, I'm going to add a 5th portion. So while I'm doing the mitzvah, I'm adding a part to it. Now, what happens if I put on my tefillin and I take off my tefillin and I put on my tefillin and I take off my tefillin? People do it a lot. There's no Baal Toisef at all. Here we're saying by Carbonaries, it's not that way. If I'm going to bring another Karban Oilas Re'iyah, I'm violating Baal Toisef. Let me tell you another heads up, which will make this even more fascinating. Even according to this final understanding, and indeed, Rabbi Yechanan Bechlal Paskin like Rabbi Yechanan holds that once I showed up once and I fulfilled the mitzvah of bringing a Karban Oila, on that Yom Tiv, I'm not allowed to bring another Karban Oila. When you come the first time, don't think you can only bring one Karban Oila. When I come the first time, I can bring 10 Karbanos Oila. I can bring 1,000 Karbanos Oila the first time. But once I brought it, when I appeared for the first time, when I reappear, I'm not allowed to bring any more Karbanos Oilas Re'iyah. And a Shlakish holds Re'iyas Panim Bekarban, that when the Mishnah says Hara Oyin has no upper limit, it also means bringing as many Karbanos as you want. Not only during the first time, everyone agrees you can bring as many as you want, but every time you reappear, you could opt in to reappear with a carbon. Da'afilu karbanami ein lo ishir. Now that this is taka what they are arguing about, so now comes a question that is going to be asked by Team Rabbi Yechanan against Team Reish Lakish. It says a pasuk in Mishlei, Hoikar raglocha mi beis reyecha. Make your feet scarce when you are in the house of your friend. The pshat of this pasuk is, and we all know this in our bones, that if you are a guest in someone's home, don't overstay your time. Your taka being received nicely, but in Brazil they say that a guest is like a fish. After 3 days it starts to stink. Now we have to be very hospitable, but King Solomon is giving that's the pshat, a good eitzah. Hoika raglacha. Hoika means make it expensive, make it scarce, make it something that you don't just keep on staying in your in your base reyecha. However, the Braisa is understanding this pasuk is referring to Carbonaries. And hoika raglacha me beis reyecha means that don't keep on coming and showing up and bringing Carbonaries. Reish Lakish says, keep on coming back and bring Carbonaries and bring another carbon. No, you brought it, let it be. That's a kasha. Answers the Gemara, no. The type of Carbonaries that the Braisa is applying this verse for are Carbonaries chatos and hashamis. The Braisa is really saying that King Solomon is saying, don't feel that since after the fact, after the sin, you can rectify it by bringing sacrifices, lest the person say, okay, so I'll sin and I'll keep on calm and I'll bring Carbonaries. The pasuk is saying, no, don't bring Carbonaries, means don't sin to bring Carbonaries. Hasam b'chatois v'shamois, kid Rab Levi. Rab Levi already pointed out this contradiction. It says this verse in Mishlei, Hoika raglocha bebeis reyecha, which is understood also to mean that bringing Carbonaries should be something scarce, should be something that we don't do that often. But on the other hand, it says in Tehillim, Avoi beischa ba'olos, I will always come to your house bringing Carbonaries. So is it something great to continuously bring sacrifices or not? And the answer is, Rab Levi answers like Hashem, Chatois and Hashamois, that is something that hoika raglacha. In other words, don't sin and you won't have to bring Carbonaries. And Kan ba'olos ushlamim, and Tanya nami hachi, not only did an Amayra understand it that way, but we found this later even in a work of Tanoim in a Braisa, when it says, hoika raglacha mebeis reyecha, so the Braisa says, B'chatois v'ashamois ha'kosav medaber. The Braisa is asking on itself, maybe there's an inyan not to bring too many sacrifices. No, that there is not. That I'm going to come into your house with an oila. And I'm always going to pay my vows of sacrifices. They're not supposed to be scarce. the more the better. You know, the Frierdiker Rebbe once visited the yeshiva Toim Chetmim in Atvatsk. Came to visit his yeshiva. And the Bikurim on their own, they were davening mincha, they had the Rebbe was them, they skipped Tachnun. They didn't say Tachnun. So the Frierdiker Rebbe turned and he says, what's today? There's no Tachnun. So they told him, the Rebbe's here. The Rebbe's here, we're going to say Tachnun. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, the Rebbe's here is a reason why not to sin. Not a reason not to say Tachnun. In other words, don't sin and don't bring Carbonaries, Chatois, and Hashomis. Oilas and Shlamim, Resh Lakish holds, the more the better, and even Oilas Re'iyah, even though you fulfilled your obligation, every time you come back, again, not that you're obligated, but it's going to be accepted. That's the meaning. There has no upper limit. You don't have to, but the more, the better. And every time you do it, you get another mitzvah. Okay. We learned above in the Braisa, when it says, Kol Zechurcha, so the Braisa says that we should not appear in groups, or we should not appear in halves. What does that mean? So Rabbi Yosef Lameima, Rabbi Yosef initially understood that this means, listen to this, that man the Islu lay Asar Abanim, if someone has 10 sons, think about it. Practically, you have 10 sons, and you come to the Beis Hamikdash, and you want to have the experience with your children. So you'd say, I'm not going to bring all 10 on the same day. I'll bring 5 today, and I'll bring 5 tomorrow. Like this, I can give every child more attention. If there's a tremendous amount of people, we know from 770 there's pushing, I can protect them better. So a person should not say, Loi lisku ha'idna chamisha l'mach chamisha. Don't bring half today and half tomorrow. That's the meaning of the Braisa. Yerah kol zechurcha. Everyone in your group should come up together. So the Gemara says, the fact is that it's correct. Don't bring 5 only tomorrow, but we don't need a verse for that. Dav Zayin Amud Beis. Amalei Abaya, classic. Abaya told Rabbi Yosef, Pshita, what, I need a verse for that? How can a father who is aspiring to be an educator, a real father, how can he ever not bring 5 today? Which 5 will he not bring today? He's going to be teaching some of his children to delay doing mitzvahs. Wow, the word poishim normally means a person who's mamish violating a commandment on purpose. The word poishim here means to be a person that's lazy, to be a person that's negligent. Now, the truth is, if a person comes to Yerushalayim and for whatever reason they didn't enter the temple compound on the first day, then they should enter tomorrow. And the first time they come, they are obligated to bring a carbon oilas re'iyah. We know that. But you never lechatchila tell a person, come, go tomorrow. You have to go the first opportunity. A father would never keep 5 away, and which ones are only...
These are the sons that are over bar mitzvah?
These are the sons that are over bar mitzvah, and mitzat chinuch, the sons that he can walk holding their hands. Same concept. You don't want to be machanach a child. Some children are going to be zrizim. You're educating some of your children to be expedient, to be diligent, as all should be, and some of them should be poishim, gavalt, should be negligent. So you're right that a father should never bring his sons in groups. Bring them all together the first time, ASAP. But why do we need a pasuk? What's the kol zechurcha? So we already learned this above. Ella kralamayasa, like lechida achedim. This is really alluding to that which achedim, Rav Meir's temporary name, taught us elsewhere, the Tanya, that if you have people that have a very bad body odor, for example, their livelihood comes from being hamekamates, they gather the manure, the dung of dogs, and the hamitzaref nechoshes, people that are copper smelters, they have a terrible body odor, or vahabursi, people that are tanners, they turn hides into leather. Since they have such a bad odor, Peturim and Hariyah, they are exempt from the obligation of appearing during these 3 times in the year, because it says, Kol Zechurcha, all of your menfold, teaching you, Misha Yachala Alois, Im Kol Zechurcha, someone who's able to go up together with everyone else, they are obligated. Yatsu Elu She'en Yecholim La'alis Im Kol Zechurcha. They are unable to go with everyone else. Now it's really, everyone else is unable to go up with them. They don't even smell how bad they smell. But since the bottom line is that they really are, they're confined to live in isolation. People don't live with them. So anyone that is isolated in a group is exempt from the obligation of going up. That's the meaning of Chatzoyin. Okay, Atkan.
Exempt here means really they're not allowed to go, right? I mean, you don't want the guy to say, I don't have to, but I'm going to go up anyway, and then no one can stand next to the guy, right?
I don't know. That's a good question, Danny. Maybe there are different times at night when very few people are there anyway. I think, and let me add to that. So Danny's making a point. Maybe they're not allowed to go. I don't think that's Yom Tov related. Is there? What about in their local synagogue? What about in the local shop? I think because of Avos Yisrael, they should have the decency of understanding that it's very difficult to be in their presence. I don't think it's uniquely related to the Beis Hamikdash, even though maybe because they have a bad odor, maybe because it was packed with people, could be they're going to be. There's a greater emphasis of them not inconveniencing the others by showing up. But then if no one were to be there, it's 2 a.m. and it's pouring rain and other people are not there, maybe they could. They're not mechuyev, they're not obligated. All right. Chavre, the second Mishnah in the Masechta, and I just to give a heads up for people that are not familiar with the whole Seder of Kachim, like Daf Zayin, Daf Ches, Daf Tes, we are learning pure Kachim. And there's a certain beauty in these types of sugyas. Now, as we spoke out in our introduction, first of all, there is a total of 3 types of Carbonaries that are connected to appearing in the temple. Number 1 is Oilas Re'iyah. Number 2 is Shalmei Chagiga. And then you have the concept that throughout Yom Tov, V'samachta b'chagecha, have sacrificial meat, and for that you have meat from any types of Carbonaries. Now, if a person made a vow and they brought a carbon over Yom Tov, so now they have meat, sacrificial meat. If a person had Meiser Behema, and they bring it when they're there Yom Tov, they have sacrificial meat, that for sure will exempt, and that will allow them to fulfill the mitzvah of the Samachta B'Chagech. We're going to begin to focus on the Carbonaries that I'm obligated to bring because I am appearing, and because it's Yom Tov. That's called an obligation, and there is this rule that kol davar shebachayva eino ba ela min achulin. You know what, this topic is very similar to the question that now it became common practice for people to give what we call meiser ksafim, right, 10%, 20% of your financial earnings. I'm obligated to educate my children. Can I use my meiser money for chinuch? It's the same type of issue. And the answer will be that any expenditure that I am obligated to engage in, like educating my sons, even limiting it to the minimum limitation, since I am anyways mechuyev to do it, the money cannot come from money that anyways is designated for tzedakah. Here we're speaking about the question, like we mentioned, it was just the reality that people who went to Yerushalayim would take with them Meiser Sheni money. Meiser Sheni money doesn't grow, but the produce that is designated to be Meiser Sheni, if I live far away from Yerushalayim, or if I'm not planning to go there, and by the time I plan to go there, the produce will become overly ripe, it's going to be ruined. The Torah explicitly allows me to redeem that produce on money. The Kedusha now of the money is Meiser Sheni. Now this money has to be consumed in Yerushalayim. It's not Chulin money. It's Meiser Sheni money. Could I use Meiser Sheni money to buy the Carbonaries of Yom Tov? That's the topic. Says the Mishnah. Oilos, when it comes to the first carbon type, Oilas Re'iyah, you gotta love Rabbeinu HaKadosh. He's gonna keep all of us on our toes. Ba'moyed on Cholamoyed. On Cholamoyed, why Cholamoyed? One thing is clear, that Oilas Re'iyah is an obligation to bring the first time we appear. And ideally, when should we appear? The first day Yom Tov. If we don't appear the first day Yom Tov, the Gemara just called us Poishim. Not Poishim, but we're negligent, we're lazy. So why does the Mishnah speak about using Meiser Sheni money to buy oilos on Chol HaMoyed? The Gemara is going to address that. So there's many layers to the Mishnah. So now shelve the Moyed. It doesn't only mean Chol HaMoyed. There's a reason why it says Moyed, but we'll get to that later. Can you use Meiser Sheni money for oilos? No, you may not, and there's no debate about that. Ba'ois only min achulin. Why? Because of the rule that kol davar shebechayva eina ba ela min achulin. You can't use your anyways designated Meiser Sheni money to buy a oilas re'iyah. Now, by the way, people would use the Meiser Sheni money not only in the market. Many people would use this money to buy shlamim. They would buy sacrifices and they would bring them and then would eat the meat. But these are donated shlamims. These are not shlamims or karbanis that you are obligated to bring because it's yamtiv. To use it for an oila, you may not. However, v'hashlamim min hamaiser. Shlamim means shalmei simcha. Shalmei simcha, the third carbon category. Even though this money needed to be spent anyways, it's not chulin, who cares? If you are going to buy a more karbanei shlamim with Meiser Sheni money and you are eating it, you're fulfilling v'samachta b'chagech. Now you would think that Shalmei Chagiga should be like Oilois Re'iyah. I get that Shalmei Simcha is different. But here it's interesting that when it comes to the Shalmei Chagiga, here we have a Machlokes Beishamei and Beisilul. And here again, Rebbe adds another layer when he's focusing on Pesach, when really what we are discussing now is not only Pesach related, and the Gemara is going to have to explain why did Rabbeinu HaKadosh speak about the first day of Pesach. But what we're learning now really is for Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Yom Tov Hadishan Shal Pesach. The issue now is the Shalmei Chagiga Beishamai Oimrim. The group of Shammai says it has to be exclusively from chulin. Just like oilas re'iyah has to be out of pocket. You cannot use your already consecrated Meiser Sheni money. Same thing should be. Same thing is with the Shalmei Chagiga. Beis Hillel disagrees. Beis Hillel says min hamaiser. And as to say right now, let's jump to the end. Min hamaiser does not mean that you can buy all of it for Meiser Sheni money. No. Min hamaiser means that some of it could be brought from Meiser Sheni money. When I speak about some of it, let's leave the definition of that to the beginning of Daf Ches. But I want to reiterate one point, that even though we learned in today's Daf that there might be an issue of Bal Toisif, which is once you fulfill the mitzvah of the Oilas Re'iyah, when you appear again, you're not even allowed to come with another Oila. That's only when you reappear. When you come the first time, even though Beis Hillel says you can buy an oila that's only worth a ma'ah, and a chagiga only worth 2 ma'ah. If you want, and sometimes you need, if you have a big family, everyone has a mitzvah to participate in the Shalmei Chagiga. What happens if you have with you 50 people? One animal won't be enough. You will bring many animals, and you can bring many oilos the first time. So the Chagiga, like the oila, could be a large animal or it can be many animals. Beis Hillel is saying that some of it can come from Meiser Sheni, not all of it. Now again, why not apply the same thing to an oila? We'll leave that for the Gemara. So just recapping, that's important to get this base clearly for the next daf as well. There are 3 Carbonaries, and they go on extreme sides. Oilas re'iyah can only come from chulin money. No Meiser Sheni can be used. Shalmei Simcha could be used fully from Meiser Sheni money. When it comes to the Shalmei Chagiga, Beis Hillel holds some of it can come from Meiser Sheni money. Weiter says the Mishnah, not only can the Shalmei Simcha come from Meiser Sheni, it can come from any other carbon. That's the next part of the Mishnah. Yisrael can fulfill their obligation of Shalmei Simcha by bringing karbanos that they were anyways obligated to bring. So if a person made a neder or a nedava, these are different types of vows, and when they come to the Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Tov, they are anyways bringing these karbanos to fulfill their obligation. Fine, you can use these animals to fulfill your obligation of Shalmei Simcha. Or Umaiser Behema, when you own, right, as we know the dinim, if you have from the 3 animal types of bakar, vatzoin, domesticated, this is cattle and sheep and goats, then you gather them together in a pen, and there are certain times rabbinically you do it throughout the year, 3 times throughout the year, and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 10th animal is an animal that you paint with a red dye, and you declare that the 10th is holy to God. Who owns that carbon? You do. But you can't eat it in your shtetl. You got to take it to Yerushalayim and you got to offer it as a korban, and it's like a shlamim. So again, you're obligated to bring it anyways. I don't care. If you bring it over Yom Tov, now you have sacrificial meat. You will fulfill the mitzvah of the Samachta B'Chagecha with it. Now, up until here, it's not only Yisrael. That's a Yisrael. That's Kohanim. Now we're going to learn unique for Kohanim. For how Kohanim, they get a part of every chatas and every asham. A b'chor animal is given to the kohen. From every carbon shlamim, they get the chazeh and the shoik, right, the breast and the right thigh. In other words, same concept, that if the kohen is gifted sacrificial meat, if they eat it over Yom Tov, they are fulfilling the mitzvah of simcha. So Shalmei Simcha could be fulfilled with otherwise Carbonaries that were obligated to be brought anyways. It could be fulfilled with meat that they are obligated to eat anyways. Doesn't bother me. Okay. However, as we just quoted today, that this goes on everything. Shalmei Chagiga and Shalmei Simcha, even Shalmei Simcha cannot come from anything other than meat, even if it's sacrificial. But it has to be meat. Now, by the way, when it comes to birds, there is no part of the birds that a Yisrael will eat. But a chatos bird, some of it a kohen will eat. So even though the kohen is eating the sacrifice of the chatos, a part of the bird, even if a kohen or a Yisrael is eating some part of the shirayim of the menachos, has nothing to do with simcha. Simcha, meat. Simcha, not bread. Simcha, not chicken. Good.
Rabbi,
yeah.
What about just having a steak? Nothing to do with the carbon.
So nowadays, without doubt, that having a steak over Yom Tov is a fulfillment of simcha. But when the Beis Hamikdash stood, and you are there anyways, then it should be sacrificial, and we'll have that sugya in the Gemara a bit later. Okay, says the Gemara.
In Simcha L'Vasar Yayin does not include chicken?
Does not include chicken. Thank you, David. That's exactly what we're saying. Meat. Gewaldik. Says the Gemara, again, the first din of the Mishnah was that oilas re'iyah has to come from chulin. But why did the Rabbeinu HaKadosh add the word chalamoyed? What moyed? Was fragt Gemara, elo oilas only ba moyed? Who the boys men chulin? Only if you woke up on chalamoyed? Do you then have to bring it only from chulin and not from Ma'aser Sheni? But is Rebbe trying to imply, habi Yom Tov, you can buy it from Ma'aser Sheni money? No, you may not. Why would you be allowed? There is an obligation to bring an oilas re'iyah, and the rule is that any davar shebachayve, any obligatory matter, can only be fulfilled if you are using otherwise unconsecrated funds. If funds are already consecrated, they may not be used in the fulfillment of another obligation. And v'chitema, if maybe the reason why Rebbe wrote the word chalamoid is to tell you something else. Hakamash v'lan the oilos ba moyed boyos, that the oila can only be brought on moyed, on chalamoyed, but the yom tevena boyos, chevra beitza. Let's go back. On Yom Tov is like Shabbos. There's one heter by Yom Tov. The Torah says, ach asher yeyachel l'chol nefesh hu levada yeyasel lachem. In Parshas Boy. That's called oichel nefesh. Any activity that is needed for food-related matters are allowed to be done on Yom Tov, even if it involves something that otherwise would be a violation of malach. Now, eating means you're eating. Karban oila, by default, is not eaten by anyone, not even by the kohen. Which is why Beis Shammai holds that you may never bring an oila, re'iyah, on Yom Tov. Now, parenthetically, even according to Beis Shammai, there are certain sacrifices that are in the category of oila, according to Beis Shammai, that are brought on Yom Tov. For example, the Talmud. Now, that we learned in Psachim, and that we learned in other places, that whenever the Torah ascribes the concept of bimoy adoi, that this should be brought in its appointed time, and it's a communal carbon, communal bimoy adoi, even L'Kula Alma overrides Shabbos. In other words, you bring an oilas tamid on Shabbos, you can bring it on Yom Tov. But we're speaking about the oilas re'iyah. And indeed, interestingly, Beis Shammai holds a shlamim can be brought, the Shalmei Chagiga was brought on the first day. Because since the owners eat some of it, the kohanim eat some of it, then it justifies the chilul. Otherwise, chilul, just shechting is an act of chilul yamtiv. One of the lamatas malachas is shchita. Whether it's because of tzeveya, right? Whatever the isser is going to be. However, oila, maybe our Mishnah is ascribing to the concept of moed because you just can't bring it. That can't be because kaman ke Beishamai. Then are you telling me that this anonymous Mishnah is following Beishamai? That's not accepted. We always quote their arguments, but we never paskin like Beishamai. And as we learned, we had this in Beitza. We had this in Megillah. Beishamai yoimrim mevi and shlamim, that on Yom Tiv you can only bring a shlamim, shalmei chagiga. Another detail. Many karbanos, prior to you shechting it, the owner, if the owner is a man, the owner has to be soymech, smicha. He has to lean on the animal with both of his hands, with all of his might, and either say words of praise or say confession if it's a sin type of offering. Now, rabbinically, you may not lean on an animal because you're not allowed to ride an animal because he might rip a branch. And here the question is, are you allowed to do smicha on a shlamim? Now, if smicha is something that is essential, if you can do shchita, then you can do smicha. B'chlal, in many cases, there's no shvus in the Beis HaMikdash. But as we also learned a lot at the end of Eruvin, it's not a hard and fast rule that there are no rabbinic rules in the Beis HaMikdash. Beis Shammai holds that smicha doesn't have to be done right before shchita. So Beis Shammai holds, do smicha erev Yom Tiv, and do the shchita on Yom Tiv. So even the shlamim, you can't do smicha. Aval loy oilos. Oilos b'chlal cannot be brought. Because the Torah doesn't use the words bimoy adoy when it comes to my oilas re'iyah. Beis Hillel oimrim, they argue with both. First of all, not only can you bring a shlamim, but even an oila can be brought. And number two, Beis Hillel subscribes to the rule that takev smicha shchita, that right after smicha you got to do shchita, can't do smicha erev Yom Tiv. Since you can shecht it, you can do smicha before. So again, don't tell me that Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote the words Bamoyed because this Mishnah follows Beis Shammai. We don't do that. This Mishnah is following Beis Hillel. So therefore, the correct understanding of the Mishnah is Chasure, Mechsere, V'hachi Ketani. This is the way you should read the Mishnah. Oilois, personal oilois, Nedarim and Nedavis. That means all types of Carbonaries that are not Yom Tov related. I made a vow, today I'm bringing a carbon. And guys, if you remember in Rosh Hashanah, we had a 5-way machlokes tanoim. At what point will I violate thou shall not delay? I got to bring it. I'm coming anyways to Yerushalayim for any Yom Tov. I'm going to bring my pledged karbanos. These karbanos, even according to Beis Hillel, cannot be brought on Yom Tov. They can only be brought b'moed. B'moed boys, b'Yom Tov ein boys. That's rule number one. Rule number two, oilas re'iyah. Since we paskin like Beis Hillel, that can come even on Yom Tov. That's step number one. And now, when you bring the oilas re'iyah even on Yom Tov, eina ba'el min ha'chulin. Oilas re'iyah can only come from chulin. On the other hand, shalmei simcha, ba'in af min ha'maiser. They can come from maiser sheni money, like the Mishnah says. They can come from nedarim and nedavos and maiser behema and for the kohanim, no problem. Chagigas Yom Tov Harishon Shel Pesach. Again, why Pesach? We'll get there in a moment. That is where we have a machlokes. Beis Shammai holds it also has to come only from chulin, like the oilas re'iyah. Beis Hillel oimrim min ha'maiser means some of it can come from maiser sheni money. Now this is the Gemara's conclusion. Now later they found a brayso that explicitly said it so, and indeed Tanya Nami Hachi that oilos nedarim unedavos ba'moed bois. But b'Yom Tov ein bois b'chlal. Number two, oilas re'iyah, we paskin like Beis Hillel that ba'a afilu b'Yom Tov. And now our topic is, can you use maiser sheni money for it or not? Ukshiba eina ba min ha'chulin ela min ha'chulin. This concept is so meaningful. No, it's don't kill two birds with one stone. We don't do that. You want to bring a carbon, make it special, out of pocket, new money, unconsecrated money. For Shalmei Simcha, however, by Shalmei Simcha, again, Shalmei Simcha can come even min meiser, meaning complete meiser sheni money. And Chagiga Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach. Again, the question is why are we mentioning Pesach? Beishama yoiminim min hachulin, beisilol oiminim min hameiser. We're going to stop over here, and we have to clarify two things. First of all,
what about Korban Pesach?
What about a Korban Pesach?
Korban Pesach.
Very good example. A Korban Pesach, tzvika, cannot come from meiser sheni money. It's any obligation that I have can only come from unconsecrated funds. Like we mentioned, Bekitzer, that this is a halacha l'maisa topic. First of all, the Mashiach is coming today, but I'm saying the great question everyone asks is, can I use my meiser ksafim money for tuition? That is this topic. The premise, how do you apply it, there's going to be some nuance. But the rule is that anything that I am biblically obligated to do, I can only do from unconsecrated funds. Anything that I'm not biblically obligated to do, even though I undertook that obligation upon myself anyways, here there's a lot more room for leniency.
So Shalmei Simcha is different than...
Shalmei Simcha is different, Tzvika. I'll tell you why. Because God really did not tell me to bring a sacrifice for Shalmei Simcha. God told me, be happy. And Ein Simcha Ela B'Basar. It's like a whole building. And when you're in Yerushalayim, what, Stam Basar, sacrificial meat. That's what Danny pointed out before. We're going to see clearly you can fulfill Simcha anyway. And I'll tell you more than that. If there is an individual that doesn't enjoy meat, they don't get Simcha from meat, they don't eat meat. There's no chiyuv of eating meat. For Simcha, Shalmei Chagiga, I don't care whether I like meat or not. I have an obligation to bring a Shalmei Chagiga. And I'm going to eat some of that meat. So Simcha is different. Since the mitzvah Simcha, I could tap into other meats that are there from other obligations. Oilas Re'iyah follows the rule. It's a choiv, you got to bring it out of pocket. Why would Beis Hillel change this concept or give an exception by Shalmei Chagiga? That is where we're at. But before that, we have to clarify why Pesach. These Carbonaries are related to all of the Yom Tovim. So God willing, a lot more to be continued.